The Grand Hall of Convergence existed for interspecies diplomatic functions that attempted to accommodate dozens of civilizations' social structures simultaneously. Human delegate Sarah Kim attended her first formal Veltaran state dinner, her orientation briefing having emphasized that Veltaran society operated under genetically mandated caste hierarchy stable for over 5,000 years. The system wasn't just cultural tradition. It was biological enforcement through genetic engineering, so ancient it was considered natural law rather than artificial construction. Servants like Kira belonged to a genetically distinct caste, whose collars monitored behavioral compliance, delivering neurological punishment if they violated caste restrictions like attempting to eat food designated for higher castes or sitting in positions reserved for their superiors. Sarah watched Kira and other servants moving through the hall with efficiency that came from neurological feedback training. She watched assembled dignitaries, representatives from dozens of species, treat this as natural order rather than injustice requiring intervention. The ceremonial meal began with elaborate protocols about who sat where and who ate when. Higher caste Veltarans and visiting dignitaries received elaborate multi-course presentations. The servants received nothing. They'd eat later, separately, with food appropriate to their genetic station. Kira stood near the walls, available to serve but excluded from the meal. Every other species representatives accepted this as normal diplomatic accommodation of Veltaran cultural practices. Sarah's discomfort grew as she recognized everyone was participating in a system where sentient beings were genetically engineered to accept subjugation and then neurologically punished if they resisted. Her diplomatic training said interfering with host culture's practices created incidents that undermined Earth's relationships with established powers. But she watched Kira's expression. As the servant observed the meal, she was forbidden from joining. And Sarah made a decision her training explicitly warned against but her ethics couldn't avoid. Sarah took her plate, loaded with elaborate foods that protocol designated for honored guests, and walked directly across the hall to where Kira stood against the wall. The entire assembly went silent. Sarah didn't stop moving until she stood directly in front of Kira. Then she sat on the floor beside the servant and began dividing her food, offering half with simple statement, "Nobody should eat alone. Join me." Kira's shock exceeded everyone else's because her collar should be delivering incapacitating pain for accepting food above her station. Genetic markers in higher caste food should trigger immediate neurological punishment that made disobedience physically impossible. But human food biochemistry didn't match Veltaran genetic profiles. Sarah's meal, prepared according to human dietary requirements rather than Veltaran caste designations, contained none of the markers that Kira's collar monitored for. The servant stared at the offered food, her hand trembling as she reached for it, expecting pain that didn't come because species incompatibility just created a loophole in biological enforcement the system's designers never anticipated. Kira could eat Sarah's meal without triggering punishment because the collar literally couldn't detect the violation when food came from incompatible biology. The assembled dignitaries processed multiple violations simultaneously. Sarah voluntarily descended to the lowest social position in the room. She committed what Veltaran culture considered profound taboo, and she apparently found a way to subvert biological enforcement their civilization believed was absolute. Security forces hesitated because Sarah was a diplomatic guest whose mistreatment could create interstellar incidents. But Veltaran officials demanded she stop contaminating their servant with inappropriate social elevation. Sarah's response was matter-of-fact refusal delivered with casual confidence of someone who didn't recognize caste hierarchy as legitimate authority. "I'm sharing a meal with someone who was hungry. If your protocols say that's wrong, your protocols need updating." The other human delegates experienced collective diplomatic horror because Sarah just violated every guideline about respecting host culture practices. But none intervened to stop her because, despite their training, they were also uncomfortable watching sentient beings be systematically excluded from meals based on genetic caste. Kira ate carefully, each bite an act of rebellion that should be impossible, but wasn't because human biochemistry bypassed the enforcement mechanisms her civilization spent millennia perfecting. Other servants watched with expressions suggesting they were witnessing something impossible. Higher caste Velterans processed that their supposedly unbreakable biological hierarchy had a fatal vulnerability. If cross-species interaction could bypass genetic compliance, if humans simply refused to acknowledge caste as valid, then the entire social structure built on biological determinism wasn't nearly as stable as they believed. Sarah continued sharing her meal with Kira like this was completely normal behavior, while her diplomatic colleagues tried to minimize damage and Velteran authorities discovered their enforcement mechanisms were designed for internal compliance rather than external challenge. They had no protocols for handling diplomatic guests who simply refused to participate in their caste system. The resolution came not through Sarah being punished or the system being immediately overthrown, but through uncomfortable recognition that her simple act exposed vulnerabilities the Veltaran hierarchy didn't know existed. Veltaran government filed formal complaints about diplomatic protocol violations. Earth's response: Sarah broke no human laws and merely shared her meal with someone who was hungry. If Veltaran caste restrictions applied only to Veltarans, then humans had no obligation to enforce them. The compromise established that visiting species weren't bound by Veltaran caste protocols when interacting with servants. This created a loophole that servant caste Veltarans immediately began exploiting. They couldn't access higher caste food or spaces within their own social system, but they could interact with human delegates who didn't recognize those restrictions as legitimate. Quiet revolution happened through cross-species contact. Servants who interacted with humans during diplomatic functions experienced temporary freedom from genetic enforcement, and that taste of freedom made the supposedly stable hierarchy increasingly unstable. Sarah's final report acknowledged the transformation. Witnessed servant being systematically excluded from meal due to genetically enforced caste hierarchy. Shared my food with her, accidentally discovering that human biochemistry bypasses the collar's genetic monitoring because enforcement system was designed for Veltaran biology exclusively. Action created diplomatic incident and exposed vulnerabilities in supposedly unbreakable social hierarchy. Recommend updating protocols. Sometimes refusing to participate in unjust systems is more effective than trying to reform them from within, and sometimes species incompatibility creates loopholes in biological enforcement that can be exploited for liberation. Kira's account was simpler but more profound. Human delegates shared her meal with me when I was excluded from ceremonial function. Her food didn't trigger my collar's punishment systems because human biochemistry is incompatible with Veltaran genetic markers. For the first time in my existence, I ate without fear. That temporary freedom made clear that my caste subjugation is artificial construction rather than natural law, something hidden by 5,000 years of genetic enforcement that made resistance physically impossible until human biochemistry accidentally provided an exit from the system. The transformation was incomplete but irreversible. Sarah didn't overthrow the caste hierarchy through her action, but she proved it could be bypassed. And that knowledge spread through servant caste populations who now understood their biological chains worked only within their own species frameworks, and became meaningless when interacting with humans who simply refused to acknowledge caste as valid authority. One shared meal at a time. One human refusing to participate in hierarchy at a time. One loophole in biological determinism at a time. The deathworld principle that hierarchies should never override basic decency became the vulnerability that 5,000 years of genetic enforcement never anticipated. And sometimes that was enough to start making the unbreakable breakable.